$45,000. That's what the HOA president's luxury SUV was worth before an old man fed it to his junkyard crusher like scrap metal. No shaking hands, no asking for opinions, just action, the sound of metal screaming and that thin smile spreading across his weathered face. 72 hours before that moment, Charlotte Beaumont thought she could intimidate a 78-year-old Texas veteran. She was wrong, dead wrong, and now that expensive SUV was becoming a 2-foot metal cube. If you're watching this from wherever you found it, drop a comment below and let me know, because this story's gonna make you laugh and breathe easy at the same time. It started on a peaceful Monday morning in Pine Valley Estates. I was sitting on Grandpa Frank's weathered wooden porch, sipping Maxwell House coffee that steamed in the cool Texas air. Frank Morrison, everyone called him Grandpa even if they weren't related, was rocking gently in his old chair, eyes scanning across Morrison's salvage yard like he'd done for 40 years straight. The morning was perfect. Birds chirping, gentle breeze rustling through the oak trees, distant hum of highway traffic. I was showing him photos from my software engineering job back in Austin, enjoying 2 weeks of vacation time I'd saved up specifically to visit him. You know, Connor, Frank said, voice carrying that gravelly wisdom that comes from surviving Vietnam and building a business from nothing. I built that shed back in 1987, same year Maggie gave me this hammer. He pointed toward the old ranch shed where a vintage claw hammer hung on the weathered wall. The peace shattered when we heard an engine sound, not the gentle approach of a neighbor, but aggressive acceleration getting closer and closer. I raised an eyebrow. Someone's driving way too fast. Frank's rocking chair stopped dead. He set his coffee cup down with the kind of deliberate motion that told me his military instincts were kicking in hard. Connor, get inside the house. Why would I? Vroom. The engine revved higher, getting closer, clearly intentional. Through the gap in our fence line, I caught a flash of pristine white metal. A Range Rover. Expensive as hell, tinted windows, license plate that read, Queen 1. Frank grabbed my shoulder and pulled me behind the porch pillar. Stay down, son. I could see through the windshield some woman in designer clothes, perfectly styled blonde hair, expression of cold determination. This wasn't any accident. She pulled right up to our property line and stepped out like she owned the entire neighborhood. Designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Fake sweet smile that reminded me of those corporate executives who fire half the company right before Christmas. Mr. Morrison, she called out, voice dripping with that artificial southern charm that sets your teeth on edge. I'm Charlotte Beaumont, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. Such a pleasure to finally meet you. Frank stood slowly, every movement measured and careful. At 78, he still carried himself like the tactical advisor he'd been after Vietnam. Back straight, eyes alert, ready for anything. Ma'am, he said simply, tipping his head with the kind of old-school politeness that came naturally to his generation. Charlotte's smile widened, but it never reached her eyes. I'm here to discuss a small concern about property boundaries. That charming little shed of yours seems to be sitting awfully close to our common area. That shed's been standing in the exact same spot for 36 years, Frank replied, voice steady as bedrock. Charlotte's mask slipped just a fraction. Well, times change, sweetie. We need to modernize this area, bring it up to current standards. I'm prepared to offer you $60,000 for your property, very generous for a salvage yard. The way she said salvage yard made it sound like she was describing a sewage treatment plant. Frank's answer was immediate and final. No. That single word hung in the air like a judge's gavel. Charlotte's fake sweetness evaporated completely. Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand your position here. I have resources and connections throughout this community. This neighborhood is evolving, and frankly, this junkyard simply doesn't belong anymore. That's when Tommy Rodriguez emerged from the Range Rover, 6 feet of pure muscle stuffed into an HOA polo shirt, the kind of guy who probably peaked in high school football and never got over it. Mrs. Beaumont, is there a problem here? Tommy asked, cracking his knuckles like some B-movie villain. Charlotte turned back to Frank with renewed confidence. No problem at all, Tommy. I'm just explaining the realities of modern community living to Mr. Morrison. She fixed Frank with a stare that could freeze hellfire. 72 hours to think it over, Mr. Morrison. After that, well, compliance inspections can become very thorough indeed. The threat was crystal clear. Frank didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't make any dramatic gestures. He just stood there, absorbing every word, filing it all away in that tactical mind of his. After they drove off in their expensive Range Rover, I exploded with righteous anger. Grandpa, that woman just threatened you. We need to call the police, the FBI, somebody. But Frank was already walking toward the shed, running his weathered fingers along the old claw hammer that Maggie had given him all those years ago. Inside the shed, family history surrounded us like a warm blanket, wedding photos hanging on the wall, the workbench where Frank had taught me to fix things when I was just a kid, 40 years worth of spare parts and memories scattered everywhere. Frank sat down heavily, holding that old hammer, staring at a framed picture of him and Grandma Maggie on their wedding day. For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked every single one of his 78 years. Maggie always said I was a bit stubborn, he murmured, thumb tracing the edge of the photo. Maybe she was right about that. I sat down beside him, watching this man who'd survived war and built a life from scratch, wrestling with something I couldn't quite understand. Do you regret anything, Grandpa? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, just that I didn't tell her I loved her more often than I did. That night, I researched Charlotte Beaumont online until my eyes burned from staring at the screen. What I found made my blood run cold. She'd systematically purchased 47 out of 48 properties in Pine Valley estates over the past 3 years. Frank's land was the only piece missing from whatever massive puzzle she was building. As I was about to close my laptop, Frank appeared in the doorway holding the original property deed from 1987. "Connor," he said quietly, "have you ever learned about salvage rights?" He sat down across from me, spreading the yellow documents across the kitchen table. "Not everything that gets left behind is just trash, son. Sometimes it becomes potential treasure." That night, as Tommy's SUV sat parked exactly on our property line like some kind of territorial marker, I couldn't shake the feeling that my grandfather was playing a game nobody else even knew had started. The next morning brought a stack of official papers thick enough to choke a horse. Building code violation notices, environmental inspection requirements, $500 per day fines starting immediately, 48-hour compliance deadlines, the works. I was ready to call every lawyer in Texas, but Frank just sat there reading each document with the kind of methodical patience that made me want to scream. "This is harassment," I shouted, waving the papers like they were on fire. "We're calling the police right now." Frank looked up from the documents with that calm expression that never seemed to crack. "Already did, son. They said it's a civil matter." That's when I realized Charlotte Beaumont wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president. She was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. My software engineering background had taught me that every system has vulnerabilities, so while Frank studied those legal documents, I decided to do some digital reconnaissance of my own. Charlotte's home Wi-Fi network was laughably unsecured. Password was literally Charlotte's Web, with no additional security whatsoever. Within 20 minutes, I was browsing through her email like I was reading the morning newspaper. What I found there made my hands shake with pure rage. Charlotte wasn't just trying to buy Frank's property. She was orchestrating the complete destruction of Pine Valley Estates to build something called Texas Hill Country Luxury Resort and Spa. Her emails laid out the entire scheme, a $50 million development project that would transform our quiet neighborhood into a playground for wealthy Dallas and Austin elites seeking an authentic Texas ranch experience. Frank's 12 acres of salvage yard weren't just in the way, they were the prime real estate she needed for the resort's main entrance. The deeper I dug into Charlotte's digital life, the uglier things got. Financial records showed she was leveraged to the absolute maximum, with construction loans due in just 8 months. If this resort project failed, she'd face complete financial ruin for the second time in her life. Bankruptcy records from 2008 showed she'd already lost her family's construction fortune once before. But the worst part was discovering the systematic bribery campaign she'd been running through City Hall. Building inspectors, environmental officials, even some folks in the municipal planning department, Charlotte had been spreading money around like fertilizer, ensuring that any compliance issues would be fast-tracked through the system with minimal oversight or appeal option. I'd printed everything I could find, building a folder of evidence that would make any federal prosecutor salivate with anticipation. That afternoon, Charlotte called Frank directly, and I listened on the extension while recording everything on my phone. "Mr. Morrison," she began, her voice carrying that fake sweetness again, "I heard you're being difficult about our generous offer. Let me be crystal clear about something. I own this town. The city inspector owes me favors, the HOA board answers to me, and even some folks down at City Hall understand the importance of community progress." Frank's response was measured and careful. "What exactly are you saying, Mrs. Beaumont?" Charlotte's laugh was like broken glass scraping against concrete. "I'm saying that life can become very complicated for people who don't understand cooperation. Your utilities might need emergency inspections. Your business licenses might require additional documentation. Your property might attract environmental concerns. Food for thought, Mr. Morrison. The threat was so blatant it was almost cartoonish, but Frank just thanked her politely and hung up the phone. That evening, I couldn't contain my frustration anymore. Grandpa, we're just sitting here taking this abuse like punching bags. We need to fight back. Lawyers, media attention, something. Frank set down his coffee and looked at me with those steady gray eyes that had seen more than I could imagine. Fight back with what, Connor? Lawyers cost money we don't have. Media attention brings scrutiny we can't control. You think I've got enough resources to go toe-to-toe with the Beaumont fortune? I threw my hands up in exasperation. So we just give up? Let them steamroll us into oblivion? Frank shook his head slowly. I never said give up, son. I said wait. Wait for what? Wait for them to make mistakes. Bullies always do, Connor. Always. He pulled out that old property deed again, pointing to a section I'd overlooked before. See this clause right here? Grantor reserves perpetual salvage rights to any abandoned property within property boundaries for duration exceeding 72 hours. I squinted at the legal language. What does that mean exactly? Frank's explanation was simple and devastating. Means if someone leaves their property on our land for more than 3 days, that property legally becomes ours under Texas state law. I stared at him like he'd just spoken ancient Greek. But who would be stupid enough to abandon expensive property on someone else's land? Frank's smile was thin but genuine. Arrogant people usually make stupid decisions, Connor, especially when they think they're untouchable. That night, I watched Tommy Rodriguez drive by our property line for the 3rd time in 2 hours, obviously conducting some kind of surveillance operation. Each time he passed, he slowed down just enough to take photos of our fence line, our shed, our house, building some kind of case file for Charlotte's next move. But what really caught my attention was how he lingered at the property boundary, like he was measuring distances or calculating angles. Around midnight, I noticed our security cameras had been tampered with, not destroyed, just repositioned to face different directions. Whoever had moved them knew exactly what they were doing, creating blind spots in our surveillance coverage without making it obvious they'd been there at all. When I mentioned this to Frank the next morning, his reaction surprised me. Good, he said simply. Let them think they're being clever, Grandpa. Someone's watching us, probably planning their next attack, and you're happy about it? Frank poured himself another cup of Maxwell House and settled into his morning routine like nothing had changed. Connor, sometimes the best way to catch your enemy is to let them think they're hunting you. Before I could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, the phone rang with Charlotte's voice on the other end, honey sweet and poison deadly. Mr. Morrison, I hope you've had time to reconsider our conversation yesterday. I'd hate for things to escalate unnecessarily. Frank's response was polite but firm. Still thinking it over, Mrs. Beaumont. Well, don't think too long. I've scheduled an environmental inspection for tomorrow morning, just routine compliance checking, you understand, and I'm afraid your utilities might need temporary disconnection for safety concerns. Nothing personal, just community standards. After she hung up, I stared at Frank in disbelief. She's cutting our power and water tomorrow, and you're just gonna let her? Frank walked over to the window and looked out at Tommy's black SUV, which had been parked on our property line for exactly 70 hours and counting. Connor, he said quietly, tomorrow morning you're going to learn something very important about patience, timing, and the difference between revenge and justice. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Tommy's engine idling just outside our fence, I had no idea that my 78-year-old grandfather was about to teach Charlotte Beaumont the most expensive lesson of her entitled life. Wednesday morning brought Charlotte's promised siege in full force. The electricity died at exactly 8 a.m., followed by water service 30 minutes later, followed by our internet and phone lines an hour after that. Official city trucks appeared with workers who claimed they needed to perform emergency safety inspections on our utilities. But I noticed they all seemed to know exactly where to look and what to disconnect. Charlotte had orchestrated this whole operation with military precision, turning our home into an isolated island in the middle of Pine Valley Estates. I tried calling every city department I could think of, but got bounced between voicemails and bureaucratic runarounds that would make a Soviet commissar proud. The only person who showed any genuine concern was Officer Bradley Hayes, who stopped by that afternoon with some unofficial advice. Honor, Frank, Officer Hayes said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Off the record, you need to document everything that's happening here. Build your case carefully before you go public with it. He handed me a small digital recorder and a stack of legal pads. Photograph every violation, record every conversation, keep detailed notes about times and dates. Something big is coming down the pipeline and you'll want ironclad evidence when it hits. Frank thanked him with the kind of quiet dignity that made you understand why people respected him so much. Then walked Officer Hayes back to his patrol car while I started documenting our situation with obsessive detail. Every cut wire, every disconnected pipe, every official notice got photographed and cataloged like crime scene evidence. That evening, Charlotte held what she called a neighborhood safety meeting at her mansion, a sprawling McMansion that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought bigger automatically meant better. Through the tall windows, I could see 30 or 40 residents packed into her living room, watching a slide presentation on a massive flat-screen TV. I crept close enough to record the audio through my phone, and what I heard made my blood boil with righteous fury. As your HOA president, I'm deeply concerned about environmental hazards affecting our property values, Charlotte announced to her captive audience. Some establishments in our community simply don't meet modern safety standards, and frankly, they're dragging down everyone's investment. The photos on her screen showed Frank's salvage yard from carefully chosen angles that made it look like a post-apocalyptic wasteland instead of the well-organized business it actually was. The junkyard is an eyesore and an environmental disaster waiting to happen, Charlotte continued, clicking through images of rusty car parts and old machinery. Mr. Morrison needs to understand that times have changed, and some businesses simply don't belong in civilized communities anymore. The crowd murmured agreement, heads nodding like bobbleheads in a hurricane. These were people who'd moved to Pine Valley Estates for the quiet suburban lifestyle, and Charlotte was convincing them that Frank represented some kind of existential threat to their property values and children's safety. I wanted to burst through those windows and show them the real Charlotte, the emails about bribes and resort developments and financial desperation. But Frank's voice echoed in my head, "Build your case first, son, then go public." The harassment escalated dramatically over the next 3 days. Thursday night, someone slashed all 4 tires on Frank's pickup truck, leaving them deflated like punctured balloons in our driveway. Friday morning, we found paint thrown across our mailbox, bright orange paint that spelled out "Leave" in letters big enough to read from the street. Saturday brought rocks through our front windows, scattered glass glittering on the living room floor like deadly confetti. Each time we called the police, they took a report and promised to investigate, but somehow no evidence ever materialized and no witnesses ever came forward. Meanwhile, Tommy Rodriguez continued his surveillance routine, parking that black Honda Pilot exactly on our property line and taking photos of everything we did. Frank's response to this escalating campaign surprised me with its complete lack of visible anger or frustration. While I paced around the house like a caged animal, ranting about lawsuits and media attention and calling the FBI, Frank just went about his daily routine with unshakable calm. He fixed the broken windows himself, cleaned the paint off our mailbox without complaint, and replaced his truck tires like it was just another maintenance task. But I was learning to read the subtle signs of his emotional state, the way he held his coffee cup a little tighter, the way his jaw muscles tensed when he thought nobody was looking, the way he spent longer than usual staring at Maggie's picture before bed each night. The breaking point came on Sunday evening when I found Frank sitting in his shed, surrounded by 40 years of memories and holding that old claw hammer like it was the only solid thing left in a world gone mad. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw tears on his weathered cheeks, just a few drops, but they hit me like hammer blows to the chest. 40 years, Connor, he whispered, voice cracking with emotion I'd never heard before. I built this place from nothing. After Vietnam, worked 18-hour days to make it profitable, raised my family here, buried my wife from this house. 40 years of my life, and they want to erase it like it never mattered. I sat down beside him, putting my arm around shoulders that had carried more weight than most men could imagine. It does matter, Grandpa. You matter. This place matters. We're not going to let them win. Something shifted in Frank's expression then. Tears drying up, backbone straightening, that tactical mind engaging with problems instead of just enduring them. He stood up slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, and walked over to look out the shed window at Tommy's Honda Pilot, sitting in its usual spot. "Connor," he said quietly, "tomorrow morning I'm going to teach you something about operating heavy machinery." He pointed toward the massive crusher that dominated one corner of our salvage yard, a hydraulic monster capable of compressing a full-size sedan into a cube small enough to load on a pickup truck. "That machine has been sitting idle for too long, son. Time to put it back to work." That night, as I lay in bed listening to Tommy's engine idling outside our fence, I had no idea that my grandfather was about to turn Charlotte Beaumont's own arrogance into the instrument of her complete destruction. Sometimes patience isn't just a virtue, sometimes it's a weapon. Thursday morning brought a convoy of government vehicles that looked like something out of a disaster movie. Environmental Protection Agency trucks, city inspection vans, official-looking sedans with government plates, the whole parade rolling up our driveway, with Charlotte Beaumont following behind in her Range Rover like a conquering general surveying her victory. The lead inspector, a nervous-looking man in his 50s who kept checking his clipboard every 30 seconds, handed Frank a stack of papers thicker than a phone book. "Mr. Morrison, we have environmental protection condemnation orders, eminent domain pre-filing paperwork, and immediate evacuation requirements. You have 72 hours to vacate these premises." Charlotte stood behind the officials with a smile so wide it could have swallowed Texas whole, finally convinced she'd delivered the killing blow to our resistance. I was ready to fight this bureaucratic army with every legal weapon I could find: lawyers, environmental appeals, federal court injunctions, media attention, anything that might slow down this steamroller of official corruption. "Grandpa, I found 3 firms willing to take this case pro bono," I said, frantically scrolling through contacts on my phone. "We can file emergency appeals, get temporary restraining orders, maybe even get federal oversight if we can prove the bribery." But Frank just stood there reading those condemnation orders with the same methodical patience he'd shown throughout this entire ordeal, occasionally nodding like he was following some internal checklist nobody else could see. "Connor," he said finally, "sometimes the best offense is a good defense, and sometimes the best defense is just patience and timing." While I was researching legal strategies and calling every lawyer in the Austin phone book, Frank pulled out that original property deed from 1987 and spread it across our kitchen table like he was planning a military campaign. The yellowed document looked insignificant compared to the government paperwork condemning our home, but Frank studied it with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient hieroglyphics. "See this clause right here, Connor?" He pointed to a section written in dense legal language that hurt my eyes to read. "Grantor reserves perpetual salvage rights to any abandoned property within property boundaries for duration exceeding 72 hours. I'd heard him mention salvage rights before, but now he was explaining the concept like my life depended on understanding it completely. Under Texas property code and the specific terms of our deed, any vehicle abandoned on this land for more than 3 days becomes our legal property. The implications hit me like a lightning bolt to the brain. Tommy Rodriguez had been parking that black Honda Pilot exactly on our property line for 5 straight days now, conducting his surveillance operation from what he thought was a position of strength and authority, but according to Frank's interpretation of Texas law and our property rights, Tommy had just handed us a $45,000 gift without even realizing it. "Wait," I said, staring at the deed with new understanding. "You're telling me that SUV legally belongs to us now?" Frank's smile was thin but absolutely genuine. "Has for the past 48 hours, son. Question is what we're going to do about it." That's when I realized my 78-year-old grandfather hadn't been enduring this harassment campaign. He'd been setting a trap that would make Charlotte Beaumont regret every single decision that led her to our door. Meanwhile, Charlotte was escalating her propaganda war with the ruthless efficiency of a political campaign manager. She hired a social media consultant to create viral content about the environmental hazard threatening Pine Valley families, complete with dramatic photos and testimonials from concerned neighbors. Videos started appearing online showing our salvage yard from carefully chosen angles, with ominous narration about groundwater contamination and property value destruction. The hashtag #ShutDownTheJunkyard began trending in local social media circles, shared by people who'd never set foot on our property but were convinced Frank represented some kind of existential threat to suburban civilization. Charlotte even organized a petition drive collecting signatures from residents who wanted our dangerous eyesore removed from their perfect neighborhood paradise. But I was learning to fight fire with fire, using my software engineering skills to wage digital warfare against Charlotte's propaganda machine. I created a website called Watch HOA Abuse, with live stream cameras showing the reality of our situation, not the carefully staged photos Charlotte was spreading, but real-time footage of Frank going about his daily routine, helping neighbors fix their cars, maintaining his property with obvious pride and care. The contrast between Charlotte's fear-mongering and our actual peaceful existence was stark enough to make some residents question the narrative they'd been fed. Comments started appearing under Charlotte's posts from people who remembered Frank helping them move furniture or fix their lawnmowers. quiet voices of sanity pushing back against the manufactured hysteria. Tommy Rodriguez was having his own crisis of conscience during this escalating propaganda war, though he tried to hide it behind his usual intimidating facade. I'd been watching him through our security cameras, and his behavior was becoming increasingly conflicted and uncomfortable. On Monday, Frank had brought him a glass of lemonade during a particularly hot afternoon, just basic human kindness towards someone sitting in a car for hours. On Tuesday, Frank had helped a neighbor kid fix her bicycle tire right in front of Tommy's SUV, patiently teaching her how to use the patch kid, while Tommy watched from 20 feet away. On Wednesday, Frank had assisted an elderly neighbor carry groceries from her car to her front door, refusing payment and just smiling when she thanked him. These small acts of everyday decency were clearly affecting Tommy in ways he hadn't expected. The breaking point for Tommy came Thursday evening when Charlotte held another neighborhood meeting, this time featuring a professional videographer and what looked suspiciously like a rehearsed presentation for local news media. I recorded the whole thing from outside her mansion, listening to Charlotte deliver increasingly dramatic warnings about environmental catastrophe and community safety. Some people simply refuse to accept that their time has passed, she announced to the assembled residents and cameras. They cling to outdated ways of living that endanger everyone around them. Sometimes progress requires making difficult decisions about who belongs in our community and who doesn't. The barely concealed classism and age discrimination in her words made me sick to my stomach, but what really caught my attention was Tommy. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Tommy looked genuinely uncomfortable with his role in Charlotte's campaign. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact with the cameras, clearly struggling with some internal conflict between loyalty to his employer and growing recognition that they might be the bad guys in this story. After the meeting ended and the cameras were packed away, I watched Tommy sit in his Honda Pilot for almost an hour, just staring at our house, where Frank was visible through the kitchen window, reading a book under lamplight like any normal evening. Finally, Tommy pulled out his phone and scrolled to Charlotte's contact information, his finger hovering over the call button like he was preparing to make the most important decision of his life. Instead, he deleted her number from his phone completely, started his engine, and drove home for the first time in 6 days. The next morning, Frank called Officer Hayes with a simple message. "Bradley, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. Bring your camera and your notebook. We're going to need official documentation of what happens next." Then he walked over to our salvage yard's centerpiece, that massive hydraulic crusher that could compact a full-sized sedan into a cube small enough to load on a pickup truck. Frank spent the afternoon performing maintenance on the machine, checking oil levels and hydraulic pressure and mechanical connections with the thoroughness of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. "Connor," he said as the sun was setting over Pine Valley Estates, "tomorrow morning you're going to witness the difference between revenge and justice. Sometimes they look the same from the outside, but the motivations are completely different." As I watched Tommy's abandoned Honda Pilot sitting on our property line like a $45,000 monument to arrogance and miscalculation, I finally understood that my grandfather had been playing a game that Charlotte Beaumont never even knew existed. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of Texas winter day that makes you grateful for coffee and long sleeves. Frank was up before sunrise, methodically preparing documentation that would transform this confrontation from vigilante justice into completely legal property reclamation. Time-stamped photographs of Tommy's Honda Pilot from multiple angles, showing its exact position on our property line for the past 6 consecutive days. Salvage claim paperwork filled out in Frank's careful handwriting, with legal precedents printed from Texas Property Code and attached with paper clips. Official measurements of the vehicle's location relative to our fence line, witnessed and signed by our neighbor Mrs. Henderson, who'd been watching this whole drama unfold with increasing fascination. When Officer Hayes arrived at exactly 8 a.m. with his camera and notebook, he reviewed Frank's documentation with the kind of professional thoroughness that comes from 20 years of police work. "Frank, I gotta say, technically, you're absolutely right about this," Officer Hayes admitted, flipping through pages of legal citations and property law references. "Vehicle's been abandoned on your land for more than the statutory 72 hours. Owner has been notified multiple times about the violation, and your salvage rights are clearly established in the original deed." He looked up at the massive crusher dominating our salvage yard, hydraulic arms gleaming in the morning sunlight like some mechanical predator waiting to feed. "You sure you want to go through with this? Once you start that machine, there's no going back." Frank's response was measured and final. "Bradley, some lessons can only be taught one way. Charlotte Beaumont thinks money and connections make her untouchable. Time to show her that some things in this world can't be bought or bullied. The sound of that crusher starting up was like thunder rolling across Pine Valley Estates, a deep mechanical roar that woke up everyone within half a mile and brought them running to their windows and front yards. Frank operated the hydraulic controls with the confidence of 40 years' experience, slowly positioning the massive steel jaws above Tommy's pristine Honda Pilot, while I live-streamed everything on my Watch HOA Abuse website for anyone who wanted to witness this moment of biblical justice. Within minutes, our property was surrounded by neighbors, some filming on their phones, others just standing in stunned silence as they realized what was about to happen. Mrs. Henderson had brought a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, settling in like she was watching the best entertainment Pine Valley had seen in decades. Charlotte's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. She came running out of her mansion in a silk bathrobe and designer slippers, perfectly styled hair flying behind her like she was starring in some tragic opera about entitled rich people facing consequences for their actions. "What are you doing to my car?" she screamed, voice cracking with panic and disbelief. Frank handed her the legal documentation without saying a word, letting Texas property code and salvage rights statutes speak for themselves. Charlotte read frantically, her face cycling through confusion, anger, and dawning horror as she realized the legal trap she'd walked into. "This is theft! This is illegal! Tommy, do something!" But when she looked around for her enforcer, Tommy Rodriguez was nowhere to be found. Tommy had spent the previous evening having what alcoholics call a moment of clarity, sitting in his own driveway and thinking about the kind of man he'd become while working for Charlotte Beaumont. He remembered his grandfather teaching him to fish as a kid, saying, "Mijo, always respect your elders. They earned their place in this world through surviving things you can't imagine." He thought about Frank bringing him lemonade during hot afternoons, never once being rude or hostile, despite having every reason to hate the man harassing him. He remembered watching Frank help that little girl fix her bicycle tire, the patience and kindness in every gesture, the complete absence of bitterness or anger, despite being under siege for weeks. When Charlotte called him that morning demanding he stop Frank from destroying her car, Tommy's response was simple and devastating. "Handle it yourself, Charlotte. I'm done being your attack dog." Left without her muscle and facing a crowd of neighbors who were finally seeing her true character, Charlotte tried every manipulation tactic in her playbook. She offered Frank $50,000, then $100,000, then $200,000, each desperate bid making her look more pathetic and powerless. "I'll withdraw all the complaints, cancel the inspections, leave you alone forever. Just don't destroy my car." But Frank had reached that point of calm resolution that comes when you've endured enough injustice and finally have the power to balance the scales. "Ms. Beaumont," he said quietly, "you spent 2 weeks trying to steal everything I built in 40 years. You thought you could buy people to intimidate me into submission. Some things in this world can't be purchased, like integrity, dignity, and justice." The crushing sequence was simultaneously brutal and beautiful, like watching karma take physical form and settle old debts with hydraulic precision. The Honda Pilot's windows exploded first, safety glass cascading like diamond rain as the crusher's jaws closed around the vehicle's roof. Metal began folding like origami in the hands of a master craftsman, steel panels creasing and compressing as $45,000 worth of German engineering surrendered to American-made hydraulic power. The engine block compressed with a sound like thunder, transmission fluid and motor oil streaming out like mechanical blood, as Charlotte's symbol of wealth and intimidation was reduced to its essential elements. Finally, with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like the machine itself sighing with satisfaction, the crusher delivered its final compression stroke, transforming Charlotte's luxury SUV into a perfect 2-foot cube of compacted metal. Charlotte's breakdown was complete and public, witnessed by half the neighborhood and broadcast live on my website to anyone who cared to watch, entitled "Rich People Face Consequences for Their Actions." She stood there staring at the metal cube that used to be her car, breathing heavily like she'd just run a marathon, muttering under her breath about bankruptcy and lawsuits and federal investigations. "This isn't over, old man," she finally managed to say, voice shaking with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself." Frank patted the compacted metal cube like he was saying goodbye to an old enemy, then looked Charlotte directly in the eyes with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you've just played your winning hand. "Actually, Charlotte, I think this is exactly where it ends." That's when Officer Hayes' radio crackled to life with a message that would change everything. "All units, we have federal warrants for Charlotte Beaumont on charges of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion." The FBI vehicles arrived like something out of a crime drama. Black SUVs with government plates pulling up our driveway in perfect formation, while Charlotte stood frozen beside the crushed remains of her Honda Pilot. Special Agent Rebecca Morrison, no relation to our family despite the shared name, stepped out of the lead vehicle with the kind of professional confidence that comes from building airtight federal criminals against white-collar criminals. "Charlotte Beaumont, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery of public officials, mail fraud, and racketeering," she announced, producing handcuffs and reading Miranda rights, while Charlotte's face cycled through confusion, panic, and dawning recognition that her entire criminal enterprise was collapsing in real time. "This is harassment," Sherlock screamed as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "You can't prove anything. I have rights. I have lawyers." Agent Morrison's response was calm and devastating. "Actually, Mrs. Beaumont, we can prove everything. Thanks to evidence provided by Mr. Frank Morrison and his grandson Connor, we have enough documentation to convict you and half the corrupt officials in this county." That's when Frank opened the file box he'd been quietly filling for 2 weeks, revealing evidence that would make any federal prosecutor salivate with anticipation. 2 weeks' worth of recorded phone conversations where Charlotte explicitly discussed bribing city officials. Email screenshots showing financial transfers to building inspectors and environmental officers. Tommy Rodriguez's signed testimony detailing every illegal order Charlotte had given him. Bank records proving a pattern of fraud and corruption going back 5 years. The revelation hit me like a thunderbolt. My grandfather hadn't just been enduring Charlotte's harassment campaign, he'd been methodically documenting every crime she committed while building an ironclad federal case against her entire network of corruption. "Grandpa," I said, staring at him with new respect and understanding, "you planned this from the very beginning, didn't you?" Frank's smile was patient and knowing. "Not entirely, Connor, but I knew bullies always escalate their behavior until they commit crimes in front of witnesses. Your technical skills helped gather the evidence, Tommy's conscience provided insider testimony, and Charlotte's arrogance made her sloppy about covering her tracks. Sometimes the best way to catch criminals is just giving them enough rope to hang themselves." The domino effect of Charlotte's arrest was swift and comprehensive, dismantling years of carefully constructed corruption in a matter of days. 3 city officials were fired and charged with accepting bribes, including the building inspector who'd rubber-stamped Charlotte's fake environmental violations and the municipal planner who'd expedited her eminent domain filing. The entire Pine Valley HOA board was dissolved and reformed under federal oversight, with new leadership elected by residents who were finally free to vote without intimidation or manipulation. Environmental charges against our property were dropped after legitimate inspectors found no violations whatsoever. Turns out our salvage yard was actually cleaner and better organized than most commercial facilities in the county. Tommy Rodriguez's transformation from Charlotte's enforcer to federal witness was perhaps the most satisfying part of this entire story, proving that redemption is possible, even for people who've made terrible choices. His testimony was devastating and detailed, describing years of illegal harassment campaigns against property owners who wouldn't sell to Charlotte's development schemes. "She treated everyone like property she could buy and sell, including me," Tommy told federal investigator. "Mr. Morrison was the first person who showed me that you don't have to accept being someone's tool. He treated me with dignity even when I was harassing him, and that made me realize what kind of person I'd become." The immunity deal Tommy received in exchange for his cooperation allowed him to start fresh, eventually finding work as a security guard at an assisted living facility where his protective instincts could be used to help vulnerable people instead of intimidating them. Charlotte's final meltdown in federal custody was witnessed by news cameras that had been summoned to cover what they thought was a simple property dispute, but ended up documenting the collapse of a criminal conspiracy. Screaming about her lawyers and her connections and her constitutional rights while being loaded into the back of an FBI vehicle, Charlotte looked like every entitled rich person who'd ever discovered that money can't actually buy your way out of federal prison. The video went viral within hours, shared by thousands of people who recognized Charlotte as the archetypal villain of gentrification and corporate greed, the kind of person who destroys communities for profit and calls it progress. Local news stations picked up the story, then regional outlets, then national media covering the broader themes of HOA abuse and municipal corruption that Charlotte's case represented. 6 months later, Charlotte was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, with all her assets seized to pay restitution to her victims and cover the costs of investigation. The luxury resort project collapsed completely, taking down several investors who'd been counting on returns from Charlotte's fraudulent schemes. Her mansion was foreclosed and sold at auction, with the proceeds going toward compensating property owners she'd harassed over the years. Pine Valley Estates was reclassified as a historic preservation zone, protecting it from future development schemes and ensuring that families like ours would never again face the kind of systematic intimidation Charlotte had orchestrated. Our property value tripled overnight, not that Frank had any intention of selling the land he'd defended so brilliantly. The metal cube that used to be Charlotte's Honda Pilot found its final resting place in the Veterans of Foreign Wars Museum downtown, displayed with a plaque reading, "What Happens When Bullies Meet Justice." Donated by Frank Morrison, Vietnam veteran. Tour guides love telling visitors the story behind that compressed steel cube, explaining how one elderly veteran used patience, legal knowledge, and perfect timing to defeat a criminal conspiracy that had corrupted an entire municipal government. Kids ask what happened to the car, and guides smile while saying, "Well, that's a long story about how bullies don't always win in the end." 6 months after Charlotte Beaumont's federal conviction, Pine Valley Estates had transformed into something resembling an actual community instead of a collection of frightened homeowners living under HOA tyranny. Frank's salvage yard became an unofficial gathering place where neighbors brought their mechanical problems and left with solutions, stories, and a deeper appreciation for the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving wars and building businesses from nothing. Local veterans started meeting there monthly, sharing coffee and conversation while kids learned basic automotive skills from men who understood the value of self-reliance and practical knowledge. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Charlotte's attempt to destroy our eyesore had turned it into the heart of community life she'd claimed to be protecting. Tommy Rodriguez became a regular visitor, stopping by every Sunday afternoon to help Frank maintain the crusher and other heavy equipment while talking through his ongoing journey toward becoming a better person. His new job at Sunset Manor Assisted Living gave him the chance to use his protective instincts for good, and residents there adored the gentle giant who helped them with everything from changing light bulbs to deterring predatory scammers. "Mr. Morrison taught me that there are two kinds of strength," Tommy told a reporter doing a follow-up story on Charlotte's case. "There's strength that hurts people and strength that protects them. I spent too many years using mine the wrong way, but it's never too late to change." His testimony had been crucial in securing Charlotte's conviction, and the immunity deal he'd received allowed him to rebuild his life with a clean slate and a clear conscience. The compressed Honda Pilot in the VFW Museum became something of a local celebrity, attracting visitors from across Texas who wanted to see physical proof that bullies don't always win. Tour guides developed a routine around the display, explaining the legal concepts of salvage rights and abandoned property, while highlighting the broader themes of standing up to corruption and fighting back against intimidation. Kids especially loved the story, asking detailed questions about crusher operation and hydraulic pressure, while their parents nodded approvingly at the lesson about patience and justice. "What happened to the mean lady?" one 8-year-old asked during a recent visit. The guide's response was perfect. She learned that actions have consequences, and some people you just can't push around. Frank's recognition within the community went far beyond simple respect for defeating Charlotte's criminal conspiracy. He became a symbol of the kind of quiet dignity and moral courage that seems increasingly rare in modern America. Pine Valley residents organized an appreciation ceremony at our salvage yard, with speakers including the new HOA president, several city council members, and a representative from the state attorney general's office, who praised Frank's cooperation in exposing municipal corruption. "Frank Morrison didn't just serve our country in Vietnam," the keynote speaker announced to thunderous applause. "He served our community by showing us that ordinary citizens can fight back against corruption and win. He proved that integrity beats arrogance, patience beats panic, and truth beats power every single time." My own role in this story taught me lessons about strategy, patience, and the difference between fighting hard and fighting smart that no computer science degree could have provided. I extended my stay in Pine Valley indefinitely, using my remote work arrangement to help Frank modernize his business operations while learning practical skills that no coding boot camp teaches. Installing security systems, maintaining heavy machinery, understanding property law, building community relationships. These weren't items on any software engineering curriculum, but they turned out to be more valuable than any technical certification I'd ever earned. "Connor," Frank told me one evening as we watched the sun set over our salvage yard turned community center, "sometimes the best education comes from real life instead of classrooms. You learn to fight smart instead of just fighting hard, and that's going to serve you well no matter what challenges come next. The final twist in our story came 3 months later, when I was helping Frank clean out the old shed to make room for a proper community workshop space. Buried under decades of accumulated papers and spare parts, I found the original building permit for the shed, dated 1987, and signed by the municipal inspector who'd approved its construction. My hands shook as I read the official measurements, comparing them to the property survey Charlotte had used to justify her harassment campaign. "Grandpa," I called out slowly, "this shed really was built 3 inches over the property line." Frank looked up from his workbench where he was sharpening the claw hammer that Maggie had given him all those years ago, that same knowing smile spreading across his weathered face. "I know, Connor," he said simply. "Been meaning to tear that old thing down for years. Foundation was getting shaky, and the roof needed complete replacement anyway." I stared at him with dawning understanding and grudging admiration. So Charlotte was technically right about the building code violation. Frank set down his hammer and walked over to look at the permit in my hands. About the technicality, yes, but that shed was going to come down regardless. Tommy just saved me the demolition costs when he had Charlotte ram her Range Rover into it. The implications hit me like a freight train. "You let them destroy something you were planning to remove anyway?" Frank's chuckle was warm and satisfied. "Connor, sometimes the best way to win a war is letting your enemy think they're winning the battles. They thought they were attacking my weakness, but they were actually solving my problem." Looking back on this entire experience, I'm struck by how my 78-year-old grandfather managed to turn Charlotte Beaumont's own arrogance and criminal behavior into the instruments of her complete destruction. She thought she could intimidate an elderly veteran into abandoning his life's work, but instead she walked into a legal trap that exposed her corruption to federal investigators and landed her in prison for 7 years. Tommy thought he could bully his way through life as someone else's enforcer, but ended up discovering that real strength comes from protecting people instead of hurting them. The entire Pine Valley community learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from lawyers or politicians or bureaucrats. Sometimes it comes from ordinary citizens who refuse to be intimidated and know how to fight back using the law itself as their weapon. "Any regrets about any of this, Grandpa?" I asked Frank one evening as we sat on the porch, watching kids play in the yard where Charlotte's Range Rover used to park during her intimidation campaigns. Frank was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold. "Just one regret, Connor," he finally said with that mischievous smile I'd learned to recognize. "I should have charged Charlotte disposal fees for crushing her car. That would have been the perfect finishing touch." And that's how my grandfather taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's justice served cold, with perfect timing and crushing finality.
That escalated.